My name is Sari van Poelje, and I run two businesses. One is Intact Academy, where I give coaching and consultancy training for coaches, consultants, and leaders who want to sustainably change behavior in organizations. And the other is Team Agility, where I help businesses innovate their business more quickly than their products. I decided to go back to basics now after the summer, and back to basics for me is really individual executive coaching. And in executive coaching, I coach a lot of leaders, usually men, usually above 50, who are, or 45, I would say, who are at a crossroads in their career and their life. Sometimes they've gone up the ladder and they've developed patterns of behavior that have brought them to that point. But now they want to break through and they want to go to a different level, but they don't know how to do it. And the other reason is that people come to executive coaching is personally. So they've begun behaving, they're successful in their career, and then they realize that they don't really have a personal life anymore because they're always busy working. And they want to get that balance back. So those are the two main reasons. I contract usually for 10 sessions, and I have clients all over the world. So a lot of the coaching I do is through Zoom. And so I do distance coaching. Sometimes people come here and they're in my room, but usually I see people in India, in South America, in Japan, or in Poland through a virtual medium. And even then, I've noticed that it's really helpful for the executives to get some coaching, to have, I start as a mentor, I end up as a sparring partner in this relationship. Sometimes people think what I do is magic. And I guess for me, executive coaching is kind of magic. It's an art. Of course, it's an art, but it's also a science. And I want to talk about that because it's educated intuition. When you're an executive coach, yes, it's okay if you do intuition. So that's the art part, the magic part. But it's really, really important that you use the science part, the disciplined part of watching behavior and helping people to break out of patterns. So what I teach my students in executive coaching, but what I also explain to leaders who have to manage employees, is the disciplined scientific part of coaching, either employees or executives, is that you build up a discipline of observation, interpretation, conceptualization, and then intervention. And that sounds complicated, but actually it's not, I hope. But it's something that I practice all the time, every day. So to figure out what to do with someone, I first observe. So what I use for observation is transactional analysis, because transactional analysis, like no other model, has concepts to think about patterns and patterns that we want to interrupt. So I observe how people talk to their peers, talk to their employees, talk to their bosses. I watch their mannerisms. I had a client just the other day who every time he talked about his boss, he started nervously twitching his pen and usually ticking very loudly on the desk. And I thought, that's really weird. I'm going to see if this is a pattern or not. So I purposefully, kind of dropped in his boss now and then in our executive coaching. And every time he'd grab a pen and start ticking. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. I wonder what's going on there. Because the reason he came into coaching was that he found that he felt, kind of limited. He felt as if he was not being completely himself in his leadership role. And so after a time, I said, I do realize that every time we talk about your boss, you start ticking with your pen. He said, no, I didn't realize. And it's true. Sometimes people have these mannerisms where the unconscious speaks for itself. And I said, well, if you were to exaggerate what you're doing, what is it that you're really doing? And he started ticking much, much louder with his pen. And I said, what are you really doing? And he said, very softly, he said, I want to beat him up. And I said, okay, so what happened? And he told me about this experience he had the first week. This guy had been working 10 years in this context, but the first week he came into his job, he was introduced to his employees. His boss was there, and his boss, in his mind, publicly humiliated him because he told the employees something about his private life, which he'd shared in a moment of intimacy with this boss, but he had never intended, at this first introduction with with all the employees, that it be shared. I'm not going to repeat what it was, but I understand that he felt quite, a mixture of shame and rage. And this mixture of shame and rage, every time he talked with his boss, outed itself really in this pen behavior. And so there was something really he had never spoken of, but which he still needed to repair in that relationship. What it had done over the years, this little kernel of mixture of rage and shame, is that he started to hide himself and not feel so free to be close to people. Now, in an earlier talk, we talked about that people regulate intimacy and proximity through the way they transact. Well, this guy had decided to only talk from adults and critical parent, and so regulated a dominant, distant relationship with his employees. And his employees were saying, but, he's there in his ivory tower, but we can't really talk to him, which I guess at some level was true. So once I'd observed this behavior, we talked about what is the interpretation. And he said, well, I still have this mixture of rage and shame. I felt humiliated. There's still something there, and it hinders me in my work. And then the conceptualization of this, we talked about, okay, so the effect is that you transact from critical parent, which creates distance and dominance. And so what your employees are actually giving you feedback on is probably true. And then we talked about what could you do as an intervention? So what could you do to change that? And he said, well, what I really want to do with you is to practice other ways of being. So other ways of communicating. I want to use other ego states more. I want to transact in a different way. I want to communicate in a more intimate way with my employees. And I said to him, well, you do realize the consequence of that is you're going to have to let them get to know you. And he kind of blanched at that and got a bit nervous. And he said, I won't, and he said it himself, so I won't be able to do that unless I resolve this with my boss first. And so we did a lot of work on how could you start to say, give this feedback to your boss about an incident that happened 10 years ago, which is still influencing your behavior today. And so we worked a lot on how to create an internal protection for himself, because he'd never learned that, and also in the relationship with others. After about 3 months' work, he was ready to have this conversation with his boss. He'd learned a bit more about how to transact from different ego states to create more intimacy in his relationships. And his employees were already reacting and saying, oh, it's like we're talking to a different person. And they were expressing their appreciation for that as well. And we're coming with more things that really helped him work and perform at a better level. The big thing, of course, was this talk with his boss. And we prepared it really well. We scripted it almost because he knew he was going to be really nervous when he came into that room with his boss. As it was, his boss had also been in a coaching process and had learned to reflect on himself. So when this guy, my client, came to him and said, look, there's something I want to talk to you about. This and this happened. The boss did the right thing. He apologized profoundly for his behavior. And he said, I'm really, really sorry. And what can I do to help you and to support you in your functioning now? Beautiful reaction. And so this guy was free. He'd been apologized to. He got the support of the boss that he needed, and he started to be a different boss at work. So all of this to teach you what we use in executive coaching is really observation, behavior, how people behave. From that observation, we talk about interpretation. What does this mean? And you can do that with your client, or you can have a hypothesis of your own. Then we use a theory. Any theory will do, but I use TA to conceptualize it. So how can we conceptualize and generalize this observation? Is this a pattern which is something that they use all the time, or is it an incident? If this is a longer term pattern, one of our jobs is to interrupt those patterns that are not empowering. And then we do an intervention, which is linked to this conceptualization. So what could help you break out of the pattern? Sometimes you do that together with your client. Sometimes you think of that on your own. I believe a lot in sharing with my clients. And I share with them also that what we do all the time, be it in executive coaching or leadership, is observation, interpretation, conceptualization, and then intervention.